Hello and welcome to Fantastic Fights, the podcast about a middle-aged man playing adventure game books out loud on the internet. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this episode is another bonus episode made possible by my patrons over on patreon.com/HJDoom. We're playing the first Robin Hood game book, The King's Demon by Richard Carpenter and Graham Staplehurst, with art by the wonderful Russ Nicholson. This is based on the 1980s TV adaptation of the Robin Hood myths by Richard Carpenter, with that glorious 80s intro music by Clannad. We'll talk about the show in a minute because I need to thank two new patrons, kind souls who've put their hand in their pocket in order to support my nonsense. All patrons get access to a treasure trove of gamebooks and role-playing stuff, and I'm currently making good progress on a new pirate gamebook where all the hard stuff is more or less done, and now I just need to put one word after another until I've finished. So Rob and Chris, thank you both so much for your support. Aside from generally keeping the lights on, you also helped pay for the very book we're covering this episode, so your generosity and the generosity of the rest of my patrons help make this podcast better for everyone. Right, we've got a lot to get through with the rules, so I'll try and keep this summary brief and talk a little bit about Robin Hood and this iteration of Robin Hood in particular in more detail in my closing remarks. The quick headline is that this version of the classic English folk hero was a TV show in the mid-80s which was notable for portraying the medieval world in a grittier fashion than previous Robin Hood adaptations, but also bringing a little bit of pagan magic and spirituality into the stories, which cast Robin as a partly spiritual figure anointed by Herne the Hunter to stand for the common folk against the tyrannical Sheriff of Nottingham and his brutish right-hand man Guy of Gisborne. Otherwise, the stories are very much what you might expect, with Robin and his collection of dodgy mates hanging out in Sherwood and getting up to mischief on behalf of the poor and the downtrodden. It's all good fun, and the grittier elements mesh very well with the traditional adventure stories to create a show that's still just good fun, but has a nice edge to it. I'm very excited to have the chance to play a gamebook based on arguably the best screen representation of Robin Hood ever committed to celluloid. The King's Demon is the first of two gamebooks released based on the show. Apparently a third was planned, which might have been penned by Mark Gascoigne, but interest in the series was waning, so we only get the 2 volumes in this abbreviated series. Was that a tragedy? I guess we will find out. It's worth noting that although he wasn't credited on this book, noted gamebook author Paul Mason was involved in the development of the series and would be credited as the writer for the second book following this one. Some sources suggest that he co-wrote the book, but I had a brief interaction with him on YouTube, and he said it was very much Graham Staplehurst's baby. The credit for Richard Carpenter is there because he wrote the original TV series. He did not, as far as I know, have any hand in the book itself. Graham Staplehurst was a game designer for a decent chunk of the 80s and I think going into the 90s, and he worked on all sorts of things, contributing articles to White Dwarf and working on Middle-earth role-playing, as well as producing a Robin Hood supplement for Iron Crown. The Robin Hood books represent, as far as I know, his only contribution to the world of gamebooks. Let us take a look at the rules. There's a lot going on here. You play as Robin, and you've got a tick list of outlaws along for the ride, including Marion, Will Scarlet, Little John, Friar Tuck, Much the Miller's Son, and Nasir, who was very much this show's contribution to the mythos. You've got a bow and arrow, your magical sword Albion, and a handy dagger for stabbing smaller things, I assume. You've also got no less than 10 skills, which are given a number from 1 to 10. You test them by the slightly awkward system of rolling 2d6 and then subtracting your skill from the number you've rolled. This gives you a number which can be positive or negative, and that is the outcome. So if you roll 2d6 and get a 7 and your disguise skill is a 7, your outcome would be a 0. If you roll a 7 and your disguise is 9, your outcome would be -2. And if your disguise were 5, that would give you an outcome of +2. You then compare that outcome with the instructions in the text. To make matters more complicated, there's an additional table at the back where you can compare the result you've generated with a series of outcomes, which is used for certain activities, in particular healing. On the one hand, this system generates a nice range of outcomes for different positive and negative numbers. On the other hand, for a gamebook, this is generally completely irrelevant since most outcomes are binary, and I can't help but feel that a simpler system where you just roll and try and get under your skill score would have been better. The skills are pretty much self-explanatory, thankfully, and you get a bunch of points to spend on improving them from their starting value. I won't go through the details, but I'll give you my values that I've ended up with. We start with hand-to-hand, which I've boosted to the maximum of 10. Ranged combat, where I've done the same, since a Robin Hood that can't shoot a bow is a pretty poor do. Healing, which I've boosted to 10, since combat looks pretty deadly. More on that later. There's stealth, I've boosted it to 7. Riding, where I've taken a 6. I've left disguise at the starting value of 1. And minstrelsy, I've also failed to boost since I can't imagine it ever really being useful. So that remains at 1. Perception, always handy, I've boosted to 8. Charm, I've left at 1, purely because I like the idea of everyone hating handsome and brave Robin Hood on sight. And woodcraft, which I've boosted to 8, because I do hope there'll be some prattling about in Sherwood Forest to be done over the course of this adventure. You also get 5 points of power of light and darkness, which seem to be a representation of your connection to the mysterious powers that help or hinder Robin in his adventures. If that reduces to 0, then it's game over. Now we get the combat system, which I would loosely describe as a bit insane. Combat is done via a 2-page table at the back of the book. You roll against your combat skill, that gives you a combat result. You compare that combat result to your opponent's combat skill on a table, and the correct box gives you the outcome for that round of argy-bargy. Depending on your relative skills, this could be good for you, good for your opponent, or you could both stab each other at the same time. Damage is done not to hit points or stamina, but to different locations. You've got head, arms, legs, and body. The head can only take a single hit, but the body can take 5. The arms can take 3 hits, but the second hit to your arms will give you a -2 penalty to future combat rolls. There's the same thing for legs. So the combat table might tell you that you're fine, but your opponent has been hit in the leg. Or it might tell you that you're fine, but your opponent has been hit in the body. Or you could hit them in the head and take a hit to your body as well, or they might hit a bit of you and you do no damage to them. This would be quite fun, I think, if it was a tabletop RPG, but for a game book I would describe it as needlessly elaborate at best and quite tiring at worst. While there's something instinctively appealing about all the different hit locations, it's a lot of legwork for a format where honestly all you need to know is whether you won or lost and how many hit points you've got left. You get the option to use your healing skill at various points to try and get your limbs back to a state of healthiness, and there's a little symbol in the text to indicate when you can do that. But this is one of those combat systems that makes me want to find peaceful solutions to situations just to avoid having to tangle with all the bookkeeping. I will say that at least there's no null results on the combat table. Someone's getting a sharp thing put in them every round, and that's something I approve of. Overall, the system seems pretty fiddly, but broadly functional. There's nothing obvious in there that looks like it's not going to work in play. That's good. But I do feel like 10 different skills is too many for a 400-section book. Minstrelsy clearly doesn't need to be there, and I don't think you need 2 different combat skills. You could just have 1 and have it cover both ranged and sword play, I think. Stealth and disguise also feel a bit redundant. I'd fold them into a single skill. Anyway, maybe it'll all come together beautifully as we play. Speaking of which, let's play The King's Demon. The trees stand all around you, tall and green, mighty towers in the citadel of Sherwood Forest. Overhead the sun burns bright and hot, heralding long summer days to come. You are alone. You are Hearn's son. Hern's spirit is all around you. It leaps with the deer and runs with the wolves. Hern is the hunter and Hern is the protector. The sound of the forest and all its teeming lives comes to you and echoes from the mossy floor to leafy roof. You are Hern's son. You are the shepherd of his flock. Sunbeams strike the ground all around until they are suddenly cut off. The dark face of a cloud passes over the sun. It is time to return to your friends and prepare for the task Hern has given you. Marion comes back into the camp looking a little flushed from her exertions and also rather excited. Oh ho. Not going to inquire too closely into that. She has been into Nottingham today, as it is market day and easier to slip past the guards on the town gate disguised as a farmer's daughter. Will and little John walk down from the knoll where they've been practising their archery. And you all gather by the cooking fire where Much and Tuck are preparing a tasty venison stew. When everyone is present, Marion tells her news. I met Ellen today, the serving maid I used to be friendly with at the castle. She still keeps her eye and ears open for us. Remember when she told us about the Bishop of Leicester coming to visit Abbot Hugo? Ellen said all the stewards were in a fluster today as the sheriff is worried about some French nobleman who is supposed to be arriving soon. I hadn't heard of him, but Ellen said she heard his name was Sir Jean de Melusine. He's stopping on his way to York on the king's business. Marion's news sounds important to you, and you rack your brains to see what you know about Sir Jean. Make a minstrelsy roll. Well, turns out I was completely mistaken. Minstrelsy useful absolutely immediately. Congratulations on trolling me very successfully, Graham Staplehurst. Yeah, that seems like a really good opening. It's introduced all the various characters. It's done the sensible thing of introducing Hern early doors for people who might not be familiar with the TV show. And I'm already intrigued by this Frenchman. Not something I've ever said before. Yeah, good, solid start. Nicely written. But yeah, we've got to make a minstrelsy roll. Which I'll be doing with my shiny new D6s that were sent to me packaged with the book by the vendor on eBay. Yeah, they're simple, nice greenish blue D6s. Obviously I don't need them. I've got thousands of D6s knocking about the place, but there's something really nice about opening a package and getting a pair of dice with it. So I thought, these will be my Fantastic Fights dice from here on in. So I need to get a 2 or less on my minstrelsy roll, I think, in order to pass. So a 2 or a 3 on 2d6 and get a 4, and reducing that by my minstrelsy of 1 gives me an outcome of 3, so I actually very nearly made it. You have heard of Sir Jean de Melusine. He is a French nobleman who sided with King John in his wars in France, only to lose his lands after a series of defeats. Ah yes, King John's wars in France went really, really, really well. In no way. He is now one of the king's high officials, a member of the Curia Regis, and has a sinister reputation as a man with a strange and peculiar past. Much like me. I say I've got a strange and peculiar past. What I mean by that is I did briefly work for NatWest Bank. After pondering Marion's news, you realise that everyone else is full of suggestions. Will and little John's enthusiasm shows first. Come on, Robin. This is a good chance to annoy the sheriff and the king again. We could waylay him on the London road, says little John. Yeah, and think of all the finery and money you'll be carrying, adds Will Scarlett. Will Scarlett, played by professional Cockney geezer Ray Winston in the TV show. He might even fetch a ransom of £200. Think of all the help we could buy for your precious poor folk with that. Marion interrupts their urging voices. I'm not so sure, Robin. After all, we don't know very much about this man. He might be dangerous. We don't even know when he will be on the road, which makes it difficult to set an ambush. Very true, little flower, says Tuck, who insists on calling Marion Little Flower, which does kind of make him sound like something of a nuisance. He might have a troop of guards with him. Tuck's words seem wise and sensible, but Will and Little John look as though they are itching for a fight. You haven't had the chance to embarrass the sheriff recently. Do you want to set up the ambush in the hope of Sir John passing through the forest this evening, or try and find a way of learning more about Sir John? I think we'll try and learn a bit more about him. Don't want to set an ambush for him and then it turns out that he's got superpowers or whatever. I think I ought to go and speak to Ellen again and find out more about the arrangements for Sir John's visit, says Marion. She did say that she would try and get some information out of one of the guards for me and listen to all the gossip of the castle. You're not sure if this is a good idea. It is late in the day, and although you are not far from Nottingham, the trip would be fraught with danger, particularly in getting past the guard on the town gate. Marion looks annoyed when you point out the difficulties of her idea. But I know I can do it, Robin, and I don't want to miss a chance of getting at this man if he's as nasty as you think. Do you want to let Marion go to Nottingham tonight? Persuade her to wait until the morning, or go and try to consult Herne about this strange visitor to Nottingham? I think I want to consult Herne. One of the distinctive features of the TV show seems ideal to try and take advantage of it. I don't think sending Marion there at night is a great plan. My other instinct was to let her try and do it next morning, but yeah, I think Herne is the right call here. You wander alone in the forest as the sun sets and casts fading red light through the branches, criss-crossing the floor of the wood with the shadows of tree trunks. Darkness comes, and the stars rise up like necklaces draped across the deep blue of the sky. You walk past streams, rocks, mossy ancient trees and glades of greensward, but there is no sign of Herne. As you stare glumly at the reflection of the moon in a pool of still water, a horned figure appears, silhouetted against the great silver disk. At first you think it is Herne, but when you look up you see that the black-cloaked shape has the curling horns of a huge ram. Suddenly it raises its arms as if to strike at you, or hurl some deadly missile. The moon turns a terrible red colour, and you collapse unconscious. There is a picture of the devilish beast, or man wearing the horns of a ram. It's really good. Simple, mostly letting the outline do the hard work, but yeah, you wouldn't expect anything less of Ross Nicholson. Very characterful, very evocative. But I have passed out. In the woods. Not for the first time. You wake alone in the forest, blinking in the early morning sunlight. A bower of wild roses hangs over your head, and the sight of the large pink petals reminds you of the horrific moon of last night, now vanished in the clear light of day. You stretch out your hand to pick one of the flowers as a token of your dream or vision, but you forget the thorns on the branch and come away not only with a rosebud, but also a pricked thumb. As a spot of blood wells up beside the bright petals, you wonder if this is an omen, and whether it is good or bad. Then you get to your feet and stretch. After taking a long draught of cool water from the pool, you seek out your friends and wake them. So we've got the wild rose on our special possessions list. Tremendous sense of menace being generated already. After a hearty breakfast of bread and ale, you set off for Nottingham. Marion has disguised herself again, this time as a dairy maid, so that she has an excuse to get into the servants' quarters of the castle. You walk through the green splendour of Sherwood Forest, avoiding the paths and roads where you might be seen. Near the town, the forest ends, and you and Marion leave the rest of your band behind and dodge along the lane. You see the walls of the town ahead and get almost to the huge wooden gate set in the stone arch. But then you see that there is a commotion beneath them. You cannot really make out who is there or what is happening. Perhaps you ought to investigate this further while Marion tries to sneak in. So do we investigate closer ourselves or let Marion go alone? I am terrible at disguise, so I am going to let Marion go alone on this occasion. I trust her. I think she's got the skills. With a whispered goodbye, Marion is gone. You wait. After quite some time she has not reappeared, and you become very anxious. Where has she got to? You wonder, and the horrible possibility of her capture springs to mind. You wonder what the loathsome sheriff would do if he had her in his grasp again. You decide to rejoin your friends. They are still waiting at the edge of the forest. Tuck looks concerned and asks you, "Where's Marion?" You have to tell him you don't know and add that you're worried too. You try and think of some plan to find out what has happened to her and rescue her if necessary, but suddenly Marion appears dishevelled and frightened. "Oh, Robin, thank the Lord I've found you," she says, trembling. You manage to calm her down and convince her she is safe. Her first action is to lay down a gold brooch in the shape of a fleece. There's a picture of the gold brooch in the shape of a fleece, just in case you didn't know what a fleece looks like. I mean, it looks like a sheep that's missing a sheep. That's the best way to describe it. But yeah, handy, I think, for younger people and city folk who maybe aren't familiar with what fleeces look like. But we can note the gold fleece brooch on our special possessions. Doing very well for special possessions. Marion, having gathered her wits, starts her tale. "When I got to the gates, a group of Sir John de Melusines soldiers were there, escorting him on his business. Having reached the town, he had stopped at the gates where he was expecting a proper reception, but from what I could overhear, the guards saying he was early and had arrived completely unheralded. His men blocked the gates until Gisburn arrived and tried to placate his guest." Marion pauses to draw breath and giggles. Evidently Gisburn had been his usual incompetent self in matters of diplomacy and manners. "With Gisborne trying to sort out the arrangements, I managed to mingle with the small crowd of folk who'd gathered on this side of the gate, unable to pass through. Then, by some ill fortune, I snagged my headscarf on the side of a cart, and it pulled off just as Gisborne looked round. He recognised me instantly, and my heart leaped into my mouth. I don't think he believed it himself for a moment. Then he cried out, and I dived under the horses Sir Jean's company were riding." "Do you have the gold fleece brooch?" "I do." "I stumbled right into Sir Jean, who had dismounted to argue with Gisborne. So I pushed him hard, and he fell over. It was just the diversion I needed, and at the same time I seemed to have torn this gold brooch from his cloak. I dashed for the field with Gisborne's men in pursuit. I think I was nearly hit by their crossbows a couple of times, but those useless men in their heavy armour were no match for me when it came to running and dodging. I hid in a hedge for a couple of minutes until I heard Gisborne call his men back to see to Sir John, who was by then exceedingly angry. You should have heard some of the names he was calling Gisborne. I almost felt sorry for poor Guy." Marion's story heartens you, but you know you can't stay here for long. Classic bit of Robin Hood action as well. Very nice. It's nice that it's giving the merry folk stuff to do rather than just having them as the backdrop to you being awesome. You make your way cautiously back to the camp in Sherwood Forest, winding a path between fields where serfs and farmers work at sowing and hoeing. Then you consider your next move while Marion rests. By the time you have thought of a dozen plans and rejected them all, Tuck is calling everyone to lunch. Time has passed rather more quickly than you thought, and you are terrifically hungry. There is fresh bread and a thick vegetable stew cooked with herbs and spices taken from a greedy merchant a few weeks ago. After eating your fill, you have to reach a decision. You could strike out for Nottingham alone and see what you can discover about Sir John's movements and intentions, or you could try and find more information from villagers he might have encountered on his journey north. You could travel on foot or ride if you have a horse, although a horse might make you more noticeable. So, I don't care for horses. I'm going to walk to the village, I think. You strike out on foot for the villages most likely to have been used as places of rest by Sir John. The soil of the forest feels soft and springy, and you run for a while, heading for Feniglay. Heading for Feniglay. There is a good tavern there run by a man called Warren. Once you and Little John saved his son from being caught for poaching. Warren has been friendly to you ever since, and is bound to have noted the passing of Sir John. It is late in the afternoon when you approach the village. You are crossing a field when you see a stranger in a tattered cloak running from someone or something. This is very mysterious. Who could be pursuing this person? You have to approach the stranger across a field. The stranger sees you coming and turns and runs away from you towards a nearby spinney. You sprint down the field yourself and follow the stranger amid the clumps of trees. You practically run into two burly men who wear rough clothing and each carry a staff. They look like serfs or villeins, men who work the land for themselves and their lord. The fugitive has been grabbed by one of them, and you see that it is a peasant woman. Her tattered clothing and windblown hair now hang limply, and she looks quite defeated. The other man eyes both of you and the woman carefully. "Well, Tom, I think we've found who was disturbing my hens. This lass has been trying to steal my eggs, I'll warrant you. And this wild chap," he says, pointing to you, "looks like he's up to no good neither." The man brandishes his staff at you. Do you want to fight him to rescue the woman, or try and persuade him not to attack you? I'm guessing that persuading him will be a charm roll, so that's out. I guess I'll just have to throw hands. There's a picture of the two serfs or villains and the woman, sort of thing that Russ Nicholson's very good at. They look kind of cartoonish in the sense that there's a larger-than-life aspect to them, but at the same time they look very down to earth. They just look like two ordinary fellas who caught an ordinary woman. But yeah, I guess I'm going to have to try and punch this lad out. So the farmer has a combat score of 3 and I have a combat score of 10. I'm going to play this one out on mic just to give you a sense of how the combat system works. So there's only 3 rounds, so I've got to beat him relatively quickly. Presumably because his mate will join in after 3 rounds. So let's do round 1. So I go to the table at the back, a double page spread for this table, and I make a combat roll. So I roll a 7, taking away my combat score of 10. That gives me a -3 result. That means I haven't been hit, but my opponent has taken 2 wounds to the body, so he now has 3 wounds remaining on his body, and that is 1 round. Second round, I roll a 6, minus my combat score of 10 is a -4. So that is 2 hits on the arms. So that means he's got a -2 to his combat score for the final round of the combat. So I will roll 2d6 again. If I get nice and low here, this could be really good. 7, so that is -3. His combat score is now effectively 1. And looking at the chart, I see that is a hit to the head, which does in fact knock him out. So I have won the combat in 3 rounds. That's excellent. So you get a sense of how the combat works. It actually runs quite nicely. Still think it's kind of needlessly complicated for a game book, but it is pretty characterful, and having the time pressure, which I think most of the fights have time pressure on them, makes it feel a bit less attritional, and the fact that different areas can take different amounts of damage. Yeah, it's actually pretty good. Better than I was expecting, once you understand how it works. The farmer slumps to the ground unconscious, and his friend, alarmed at your skill and bright sword, pushes the woman aside and runs off. The woman falls to the ground, crying out with pain as she tears her skin on a thorn bush. You rush to her side and lose sight of the other man. A quick look at the woman tells you that she is faint and tired. But the man may have gone to get reinforcements, and you must act quickly. So I must make a healing roll. I'm looking for a 4 or less, which I should do automatically with my healing of 10. 3, that is -7. Yep, good healing. You realise that your special skills can relieve some of the exhausted woman's pain and fatigue. You swiftly gather some herbs and she soon appears ready to move on again. You help her to her feet. She sways slightly and you steady her with an arm. There, you say, don't be alarmed. I'm a friend. I'm Robin Hood. The woman gasps as if surprised, then hope seems to come back to her and lights her eyes. By Our Lady's graces, she has led you to me. I am Ellen from Nottingham Castle, Lady Miriam's friend. But we must get away from here, Robin. There are guards looking out for me. You take her by the hand and run away with her from the scene of the confrontation. As you run, pausing every so often to let Ellen catch her breath, she slowly unfolds her tale to you. They're nice to tie it all back in to the plot that we've been uncovering. Ellen tells you why she had to flee Nottingham Castle. Well, it's all down to that Sir John de Melusine. Nothing's been the same since he arrived. He got the sheriff all upset, telling him all sorts of schemes he knew about, like his attempt to claim some of the king's land in the forest near Finningley. Old Sourface has been in a foul mood, and no mistake. Anyway, last evening there was this feast for Sir John, and Abbot Hugo, the sheriff's conniving brother, came over. Well, we served up 3 roast lambs, lovely plump and juicy ones they were, with the meat just falling off the bone. The abbot mentioned rather boastfully that they came from his domain in Haxhay. Not that it's his, but it's administered by one of the abbey's priests. Then he adds that they will be celebrating Haxhay Ram Day there very shortly, it being the season, if you get my drift. Well, when this French nobleman casually remarks that he'll pay them a visit, I got a bit interested, and I was sort of hanging out near the high table. Suddenly Sir John looked round at me and gave me this horrible look. Oh, I shuddered, I can tell you. It was like someone walking over my grave. And he asked why I wasn't filling his cup and doing my job. I was frightened then, I mean. The sheriff never would care what happened to us after being given that look by him. I was sure it was time to get out of there. My sister's always said I could go back to her village and live with her. You never know, I might even marry, so I went off to the steward and told him as how I'd be leaving. But I couldn't stop myself from having a peep into Sir John's chamber before I gathered my things up. And the stuff in there. Weird it was, and not all of it natural, I should say. Funny candles and bits of metal. I thought I'd bring you something, so I opened this chest, and there were all these fancy cloaks and things in it, and between 2 I found this. She hands you a disc-shaped slice of bone or horn, which is engraved with 5 interwoven branches. It is fairly worn and looks old. Around the edges are strange markings. There's a picture of the disc. Yeah, it's got a sort of pentagon on it, made out of the overlapping branches. Then, as you know, I had to flee the castle with the guards following behind because of what Sir John had discovered. Although, how he found out, I don't know. But thank Our Lady I'm here safe and sound, and soon I'll be back with my own folk. Ellen goes off while you consider your options. Sir John de Melusine has mentioned the village of Haxhay, but you don't know what it can mean to him. Perhaps you could find out more there or in the villages en route to Nottingham. Perhaps if he is going to Haxhay, you could set an ambush for him. Mark the ivory disc on your special possessions list. I'm really enjoying this. I like that it's sort of the best investigation gamebook I've played so far in many ways. Investigations are a kind of tricky thing to do, and this is doing a really good job of it. There's a mystery. I don't think it's a particularly deep mystery. I think Jean de Melusine is one of them black magicians that I've heard so much about. But I'm enjoying all the different ways of finding out what's going on, and it's selling him as a very dangerous figure that I'm currently a little bit unwilling to tangle with, so I'm not going to set a trap for Sir John. I think I'm going to go straight for Haxhay and see if I can get there before him and find out what he's after. This is instantly making me want to write a game book where investigation is the key theme, and I can't really pay a higher compliment than that. I don't think it's necessarily the best book for reading out loud. The sections are quite long. There's a lot of reported action, which normally I wouldn't be a massive fan of because I'd be kind of going, let me do stuff, I'm the hero. But it's so nicely presented here that it's not really a problem. You soon reach the village of Haxhay, which lies beyond the eaves of Sherwood in the rolling fields of the countryside. The villagers are not in the fields today, however, but are bustling about the village from house to house, evidently preparing for some special event. Most look happy, but there are one or two worried brows, and one woman has a marked face which she tries to hide from you. You're curious to find out more and see if she has any bearing on the recent strange events. So, are you alone? I am with companions, I believe. Outside the church you meet an old friend, Father Cedric, the priest of this village. His arms are full of blossom-laden branches which he drops in surprise when he recognises you. "Well, bless my soul," he exclaims. "Robin Hood, how good to see you again, and on such an auspicious day. We're all getting ready for tomorrow." He continues chattering while he collects up the scattered branches. He realises you aren't completely aware of what's happening. "Haxhay Ram Day tomorrow. That's our feast day. A sort of holiday." He grunts as he unbends from picking up his flowers. "There's the parade of the lamb in the morning, then the hood game, and in the evening the fire of banishing is lit on Hoden Hill. But I'm sure you'll stay, won't you?" It is a picture of Father Cedric, complete with tonsure, caught in the act of dropping a whole bunch of blossom-laden branches. It's another classic Russ Nicholson illustration. He looks really friendly. All of the characters in this really do look as though they've lived in a hard world, which I very much appreciate. Do we want to stay with Father Cedric for the celebrations, go and try and set an ambush for Sir John, or disguise yourself and go to Nottingham to try and learn more about Sir John de Melusine? I think we'll stay with Father Cedric for the celebrations tomorrow. Once you are inside his house, Father Cedric talks about the celebrations tomorrow and complains of the abbot's imposition. "For some reason he's taken it into his head to put an extra tax on us this year, especially for this holiday. I really pity the villagers. Many of them barely scrape a living as it is, what with the annual tithe, the rents to the abbey, the 100 tax the sheriff takes, and all the special levies raised by the king to fight his wars in Normandy. There's many as'll go hungry this year or end up as serfs, unable to pay their debts." Classic downtrodden medieval village by the sounds of it. So, do we want to find out more about Abbot Hugo's iniquitous taxes and help the people of Haxhay? Go off to Nottingham to learn more? Or wait in the village for tomorrow's festival? I feel as though the right thing to do is to go to Nottingham to try and learn more. But I don't like being prodded towards a course of events, so I'm going to try and find out more about the taxes. Now, that seems like a Robin Hoodish thing to do. You ask Father Cedric for more information about the tax collectors, telling him you might be able to think of a way to get the taxes back for the village. "Robin," he exclaims, "the abbot is my superior. Although his commands are hard on the villagers, I would damn myself as a sinner if I were to aid you in a villainous deed, even if your intentions were good." Collaborator, basically. This is the issue with hierarchical organisations of clergy. The clergy should be answerable to the people, not the people answerable to the clergy, except in matters concerning their immortal soul. And even then, it should be based on the priest's learning, not on any status conferred by human authority. So we can seek some other villagers to help find the tax collectors, try and persuade Father Cedric, where we need to make a charm roll and get a 0 or less, which is impossible for me to manage, so I guess we will seek some other villagers. Out on the village square, where tables and benches are being set, you spy the woman with the bruised face. You approach her and speak kindly to her, asking her who struck her. "'Twas those men," she says vehemently. "Your guess is correct. She was assaulted by the abbot's hired tax collectors." "I tried to stop them taking the money. It was all we had, me and my man Peric, and he's sick. We were going to save it and give it to the monks at Croxton, in the hope that they'd make him well again with their holy cross." The woman starts crying and you comfort her. Then you ask if she knows where the tax collectors might be found. Yes, that I do. They were going on to Kelnerstone and Hockton before getting themselves back to the Abbey. I overheard them. You might just be able to meet them on the other side of Hockton. You thank her for the information and start planning. You wish to help all the villagers and this poor woman in particular. If you have a bag of silver or a silver crucifix, you may give it to her and gain 1 point of power. Are you alone or with your companions? Well, I don't have a crucifix. You set off immediately for Hockton. It is not far, and after skirting the village you soon find the road again and look for somewhere to set an ambush for the tax collectors. While you search close to the shadow of Sherwood Forest, your sight is drawn to the majestic trees on the rocky slopes. Suddenly, there is a mysterious glow which glows brighter until in its midst you discern the horned figure of Herne the Hunter. Robin near the hood. Do not be afraid to face the evil in the fire. Use the power of light and darkness that is in you. Who holds the skull? Where you see one, there will be two. Bright steel and brighter spirits in turn shall overcome them. Herne is gone. Pondering his words, you continue your preparation for an ambush. So this seems like useful information. I mean, it doesn't. It seems like completely useless information. But I'm sure there's something useful in there. Evil in the fire. Use the power of light and darkness to overcome the evil in the fire. Who holds the skull? Where you see one, there will be two. Oh, yeah, not sure. But certainly intriguing. Herne is gone. Pondering his words, you continue your preparations for an ambush. You find a good site, and not a moment too soon. In a couple of minutes you hear horses coming along the road from Hockton. There are 3 mailed guards flanking a cart drawn by a mule and driven by a black-habited monk. With whispered commands you direct your companions' fire against the 2 outriders while you shoot the leader. I mean to make a single ranged combat roll against a ranged number of 4, which is effectively the opponent's skill, but for shooting. I have a ranged combat of 10. I get 7, that is a -3. I hit the fellow in the body twice, somehow, with 1 arrow. I guess it's just a bigger wound. Have you overcome the man with a single shot? I have not. So I must rush out and attack him and mark any wounds you have given him. So let's mark the 2 body wounds. The least helpful of the wounds. He fights from horseback. He has a combat skill of 5. You cannot hit a mounted man in the head. Ignore any head wound you give him. Treat the blow as having missed. And we have 4 rounds of combat to enjoy. So I won't do this on Mike. I'm going to roll some dice. I have managed to overcome the guard within the 4 rounds specified. Didn't land a single head blow, which is good given that they don't count. Mostly just punched him in the leg, which seems appropriate for a guy on horseback. Annoyingly, even though it is arguably ridiculous, the combat feels really good. The rider slumps unconscious to the ground. Which of us hasn't passed out from being repeatedly stabbed in the leg? You leave him and turn your attention to the monk who is cowering on the cart. He practically thrusts the tax money into your hands from where it was concealed beneath some sacks of grain, which are also being taken to the abbey. You have no quarrel with the monk, and you let him on his way. After all, he'll be able to tell Abbot Hugo exactly who robbed him, which adds to the enjoyment of a good piece of work. 2 bags of silver will keep the villagers for a long time. Suddenly you get a tingling sensation in your spine, and you feel something is wrong. Make a perception roll, needing to get a 0 or better. My perception is 8. I get a 7, which is a -1. So yeah, that's 0 or less. You think hard and realise what was nagging you. The sacks of grain in the monk's cart. Surely they couldn't have been as heavy to move as he made out. Unless... You race back down the path to the cart and stop the monk, who looks even more frightened than before. You clamber up onto the cart and heave at the sacks, feeling their suspicious weight. You untie one and upend it. Out comes a flood of grain, and in the middle of it, another bag of silver. Each sack yields another bag. You laugh and hand them to your companions to carry, and then slap the terrified monk and send him on his way. You travel back to Haxhay through the villages of Hockton and Calnerston. There you deliver their taxes back to their surprised and delighted village elders, although some mutter that it'll bring no good. It is dark by the time you are back on the Haxhay road. Gain 1 point of power. Power now 6. This is going very well. Suddenly, on the path ahead of you, you see 2 guards dressed in the livery of Sergeant de Melusine. They have heard your approach and stand their ground belligerently. As soon as you get close enough, they attack. So, they have a combat skill of 5 each. You might have already fought them before, but I haven't. If your companions are with you, which they are, they will fight the guard with the most wounds or the second guard and overcome him. So I've only got to fight 1 guard. And there's no time limit on this one, meaning that I should pretty easily deal with this particular combat. So, again, I'm going to roll some dice. I have defeated the guards, and this time I decided to exclusively attack the arms of my opponent, just punching him in the arm until he fell unconscious. Having overpowered both the men, you drag them unceremoniously back to the village. Suddenly, one who has recovered without you noticing it jumps to his feet and runs off. You unsling your longbow and pull an arrow from the quiver on your back, keeping an eye on him all the time. You draw, line up on his back, and let fly. With a satisfying thud, the missile smacks into him, and he collapses. When you check the body, you find a peculiar horn, but ignore it, mistrusting its origins. Fair enough. Don't take horns from heavily armed French thugs. It's a good lesson for life. I was so weirded out by the fact that in hand-to-hand combat, you fight until one of you becomes unconscious. Like, despite the fact that they kill people all the time in the TV show, they're always stabbing people. But it's absolutely fine to shoot people with a bow in this world that the author has created. Slightly weird, double standard. I don't know why I'm not just killing these guards. Having killed the first guard and disarmed the second, you act swiftly to ensure that you will cause no further trouble. When you drag him into the light, you realise that he's actually badly wounded. If you are going to get anything out of this emissary of Sir John, you will have to give him first aid. So, healing roll. I roll on the healing chart. My healing is 10. I get a +1, 1 body and 1 other wound. That's 2 or more wounds. The bearded man recovers enough to speak, and with a dagger at his throat is only too willing. "Oh God, I'm sorry. I didn't want to harm the old man, but he makes us. We daren't go again him." He mutters an oath, and you press him to continue, asking him who he serves and why he was sent here. "De Melusine, Sergeant de Melusine. He's our master. Oh God, he'll kill me if he finds out I've told you. He sent us to get a skull and a horn. That's what he said. The skull of the black ram, and the horn of Cernunnos curled and bound in silver." He points to the ground nearby, and you see the horn. Apologise, obviously, to anyone from France who's listening to me really butcher that accent. The wife of the headman, Aylmer, appears with Father Cedric, who looks haggard and drawn. He wordlessly picks up the horn and turns it slowly in his hand. Then he hands it to you. "You'd better look after this, Robin. They nearly got it off me, but the skull is better protected." After dealing with the guard, you feel exhausted and make ready a bed of furs in Cedric's main room. Aylmer's wife has a healing score of 9 and will aid you if no one better is present. Add the horn of Cernunnos to your list of special possessions. You dare not jeopardise the village by keeping the guard prisoner. Do you want to slay the treacherous guard or set him free to return empty-handed to his master? Bit of murder. Why not? No Geneva Convention in 1219 or whenever. This is an ignoble deed which does not befit the likes of Robin Hood or Herne's son, whatever the provocation. You lose 1 point of power. Power now 5. The morning is bright and augurs well for the festival planned by the people of Haxhay. Few stir in the village. They are making their own preparations in their homes. Are you with your companions? I am. Seems like a good plan, overall, being with your companions. You confer with your friends, sitting at one of the oaken tables which have been set between the houses in the middle of the village, ready for the afternoon's feast. Aylmer joins you with a couple of other villagers. You wonder what else might happen after last night's attack, and some are in favour of hunting down Sir John before he can get here. Others, including Aylmer, would rather see you stay in case more trouble arrives. As you sit and talk, you notice Father Cedric going across to his church for the morning service. He has to use a walking stick, but otherwise seems much better. Do you want to stay in the village or seek out Sir John? We will stay in the village. It is now mid-morning, and after a little light refreshment provided by one of the good wives, you notice the children of the village assembling in front of the moot hall. Aylmer's daughter Cerys, looking pretty in a yellow smock and ribbons, goes to the pen in the centre of the square to take out the lamb. She has been granted the privilege of leading the parade of the lamb. All the villagers stand outside their homes watching the gay procession move off. The children walk in pairs with branches and flowers held high. Some beat drums or ring little bells, and a couple of older children play flutes. I'm sure that's a delightful sound. As you stand watching, someone touches you on the shoulder. You turn around and see Alison of Wickham. Have we met her before? I don't think we have. Alison looks very distressed. Robin, it's Matthew and his friends. Edward's gone away to the 100 Court at Leafold to give evidence, and now Matthew's vanished. He and his friends have been running off quite a bit this week or so. And Jane's son told us they were planning to play a trick on Sir Guy of Gisborne when he goes through the forest on the way to St Mary's. I don't blame you. But you've put ideas into his head, and now I don't know what trouble he'll end up in. Oh, Robin, I'm afraid for my son. Alison looks strained and on the verge of breaking down. One of the village women, Elizabeth, comforts her. I feel as though we probably should have met this woman before somewhere, but for whatever reason we haven't. So, are we planning to seek out Sir John? No. So do we stay to protect the village, trusting to Matthew's luck to keep out of trouble, or gather your friends and leave with Alison? I think we gather our friends and leave with Alison. As though it's a good idea to accept the subplots as and when they show up. And I think on that note, I've been recording for about an hour. I think that might be a decent place to call a halt to this recording. No use of the sausagey finger bookmark rule. That's exciting. Yeah, it seems to be going reasonably well, although I do get the impression that I've missed some kind of plot point somewhere along the way. But, hey-ho, that's the nature of the beast with game books, and this seems, as a design, relatively complicated in terms of all the different things that can happen, all the different bits of information you can get from different sources, so it's probably not surprising that occasionally stuff happens that seems a little bit odd. I'm going to go away and play through it on my own time. I'm having enormous fun with it. Yeah, really enjoying it. I will be back for you in a few seconds with some closing remarks. Tatty bye. For those keeping score at home, I did, as usual, come to a sticky end. In a break from tradition, though, I didn't expire mere moments after pausing the recording, so that's nice. I blundered about the forest for a bit, had a moderately successful with Sir Jean Melusine, and then later a much less successful confrontation when he rather rudely set fire to me. Bit disappointing, but I was pleased to make it quite deep into the book, but with the feeling that there was plenty for me to discover on a subsequent playthrough, and that is very much the sweet spot for me with a game book. Before we get to the book itself, I want to say a few words about just how great Robin of Sherwood was. I've seen some of it before, but not for a long time, and doing this game book gave me an incentive to go back and rewatch a bunch of it. We're currently working through the second season, the last one with the original actor as Robin Hood, before he was replaced by Jason Connery, Sean Connery's son. On one level, the show is doing the classic Robin Hood adventure story with a decent cast and a fairly high budget for a UK TV show made in the mid-80s. A lot of it is shot on location, and there's a load of outdoor work which makes the world feel very real. It's got a more plausible atmosphere than some versions of the story, at least in terms of the visuals. What elevates it, though, is the way it cycles through different moods. On the one hand, you've got a very grounded depiction of Robin and his band of outlaws, but at the same time there's this magical element that intrudes regularly on the action. It's not just the stuff about Robin being Hearn's son. A lot of the bad guys have a hint of black magic about them. It's not always overt. There's a group of Templars, for example, who never do anything supernatural, but who are presented as very strange and sinister regardless. There's a sense that they've maybe picked up some weird habits out in the Holy Land. Alongside this, though, the show is having enormous fun with the recurring villains. The Sheriff of Nottingham is a glorious misanthrope, his brother Abbot Hugh is an absolute moral void, and Guy of Gisborne is both furious and deeply incompetent. There is a pantomime quality to the villains that I very much enjoy, and it provides another mood. It's something that the gamebook builds on by suggesting that the British royal family is part demon, which I very much appreciate, particularly as it's coming well before David Icke made that part of his shtick. Lastly, and most impressively to me, there is a deep distrust of authority that runs through the whole show. Although originally a commoner, it became fashionable in later centuries to recast Robin Hood as a Saxon knight, a member of the upper class, albeit precariously, whose motivation is as much about regaining his lands and position as any concern for the poor. Later versions also tend to create a contrast between bad Prince John and good King Richard, with the latter seen as an almost Arthurian figure whose return from the Crusades will set the country back on the right course and return Robin to his rightful place in society. In other words, Robin Hood becomes less of an outlaw tweaking the nose of authority and more someone who's very much part of that authority, who's invested in restoring a normal social order. Robin of Sherwood thankfully avoids turning the hero into an establishment figure temporarily slumming it in Sherwood Forest. He's an ordinary man in this show, albeit one with an unfathomably middle-class accent. The forces of law and order are shown as venal, corrupt, and needlessly cruel. There's a real sense that it's not just a problem with the people, it's a problem with the system itself. King Richard does show up, and is revealed to be wildly unconcerned about his realm, seeing it as little more than a means of financing his crusades. His depiction is still heavily fictionalised, but it's a lot closer to the reality than most adaptations manage. With the sheriff and his associates being absolute jerks, the show somehow manages to make Prince John even worse, giving us a dead-eyed psychopath who stands out as uniquely unpleasant even in the company of the show's main antagonists. It's a great show, one that is rightly remembered fondly, and I think it's aged fairly well. It's not perfect by any means, although Marion is given more to do than some versions of the folklore. This is still mostly boys having an adventure in a world where women are broadly irrelevant. But what about the gamebook? Well, I've said repeatedly in the past that capturing specific IPs can be very hard in gamebooks, which is why I came away considerably impressed by The King's Demon. If nothing else, it feels a lot like an episode of the TV show. The supernatural element has been turned up a bit to create something that feels more familiar to people who've played things like fighting fantasy, but so many of the set pieces in this book feel like something out of Robin Hood, and specifically like something out of Robin of Sherwood. The background has a certain level of historical plausibility, but it doesn't overly stress it. You can do a bunch of different ambushes in Sherwood Forest, you can rob from the rich to give to the poor, and there's fun details like setting snares or swinging in on ropes to kick guards off their horses. The sort of thing that you could see translating extremely well to the small screen. There's the opportunity to sneak into Nottingham in disguise, and there's times when you'll be running away rather than resorting to violence. Although the supporting cast are mostly in the background, they're given just enough time to make them recognisable from the show. You can get into a punch-up with the notoriously hot-tempered Will Scarlet. Marion gets her chance to do a bit of reconnaissance, and little John gets to show off his size and his strength. There's a number of points of failure that lead to your arrest, but there's a chance for your merry men to break you out of custody. Hearn rocks up several times, and Guy of Gisborne, he shows up too and is very recognisable from the show. The structure too feels like it owes more to a TV show than to the classic fantasy gamebook. You've got locations that all feel appropriate. It's about villages, the forest, and Nottingham itself. Gamebooks are often driven more by their geography than by the events that tie them together. You're often travelling through a region which contains a series of self-contained adventures. What The King's Demon does a fantastic job of is tying everything into the actions of the villains. Jean de Melusine feels tremendously present throughout the story. He's not just a guy you run into at the end. There's a few subplots, but the main narrative thrust is focused on uncovering and thwarting the bad guy's nefarious schemes. You'll tangle with his work in various peripheral events before a climactic showdown as he tries to complete his magical ritual. There's an A plot, but there's also a selection of B plots that don't really matter that much but add a great deal of colour to events. Obviously, the chance to rob tax collectors is classic Robin Hood, but there's also a tremendous rendition of an early football match which plays out as something between a crude sport and a mass brawl. There's also some details of what Sir John has been up to that become clear in retrospect, which I like. It's clear, for example, that he didn't care at all for the reception that Guy of Gisborne gave him. And I think this is one of the most important ways of creating a world that feels real, giving the supporting cast motivations and actions that happen when you don't see them. It's hard to do well in game books, but it's something I try to do a lot when I run role-playing games. I really like generating NPCs with agendas and then just have them follow their goals so that I know where they are and what they're doing, even when the players aren't interacting with them directly. It's really tricky to do in game books, but when you pull it off, it feels great, and it feels particularly good here. The example of Sir Jean de Melusine and Guy of Gisborne is particularly strong because it speaks to a relationship between two NPCs rather than a relationship between one NPC and the main character. And again, it ties back into the show. Guy of Gisborne is supernaturally annoying, and the idea that someone would take every opportunity to knock him down a peg or two is enormously appealing. That structure gives the book a slightly different feel. The core plot points are very much set in stone, but there's honestly a lot of choice in how the specifics play out. It's fairly easy to beat if you can avoid making too many stupid mistakes, but you can still have different adventures each time by exploring all the different options and taking different approaches. The fact that the climax requires only 2 items, one of which you can start with, gives a lot more freedom to enjoy all the different strands you can access as you go through the story. In that sense, it feels more like a choose-your-own-adventure book than a game book, with the replayability coming more from the story beats than from the challenge the book presents you with. There is some slight issues with the book maybe assuming that you've taken certain paths. When you write game books which have a structure whereby you get to a point via a few different routes, it is genuinely very hard to thread the needle of making it feel as though the current situation is the result of decisions you've made, even while accounting for the fact that you could have made quite a few different decisions to end up there. The King's Demon doesn't always get that quite right, but it generally does a decent enough job. There's times when it assumes you've met people or know things that you might well have been able to avoid. It isn't game-breaking by any means, but it's a small issue. If there's a lot to like from a structural perspective, there's maybe less to like about the systems. With the difficulty fairly low, there's actually less need for elaborate systems, which makes the profusion of mechanical stuff in here faintly baffling. From a pure design perspective, everything works, but with 10 different skills, a fair number of items, a selection of special items that are more like code words, a collection of friends to track, a fairly complex combat system, and a secondary resource in your Power of Light and Darkness score, there's just more going on here than the book strictly needs. In essence, it's a simple role-playing system that's been grafted onto a game book. I think if the series had run for 6 or more books, this depth of system would have turned out to be a good thing. You'd have the chance to make use of different bits of it in different books, and everything might have had a chance to shine. For 2 books, though, this is definitely overkill, though I do enjoy the light trolling that came from having the first role you make be a minstrelsy role. That made me laugh. I'm actually stealing a few bits of this for a campaign I'm running, which is testament to how well the system actually functions, even if there are far too many different variables at play. Apologies if you can hear the sound of construction outside. There's some people doing some construction outside, and they don't appear to knock off at 4 like most people in the construction industry. The core resolution system is quite nice in that it gives a range of outcomes. It's just a pity that that range is kind of irrelevant. Every skill check is a binary success or failure, which makes generating a range of outcomes kind of redundant. The author can use it to tweak the difficulty, but honestly, just rolling 2d6 and trying to get under your skill score would feel a lot more intuitive than rolling a random number and then subtracting your skill to generate another number, which you then compare to the results in the text. I think a better approach would have been to simply have the player select some skills from a list in the same way that Way of the Tiger books do, and then have the text just check whether you pick that skill. Given that there's a lot of skills that are only checked once or twice, making the player do a random roll on top of that feels like overkill. It's functional, but it is more cumbersome than it really needs to be. I was actually quite impressed with the combat system once I got my head round it. It's another thing that could be handled much more simply without it being an issue, but there is something very appealing about the different body locations having different damage totals, and the various special rules associated with damage mean that even a simple fight has lots of ways to play out. It's fairly hard to add more special rules, but the system as written is varied enough that doesn't matter in practice. You don't get the thing which I love in fighting fantasy books, where authors are continually finding new things to do to spice up a fight, but otherwise it's comfortably the best combat system I've come across, for all that again it clearly fits better in a tabletop setting. I really enjoy how you can both do damage to each other on the same round. It adds a lot of jeopardy to the process. The thing that really elevates it in practice is the use of time pressure. Most of the fights have some kind of time limit on them, and that combines really well with the different body parts, especially because a headshot is an instant win. It feels as though there's always a chance to win every fight, even if it's going against you, and that's wonderful. Every fight has its own narrative, which emerges naturally from the system, and that's not something you get very often in a game book. Praise aside, however, it's clearly too complicated, and it runs into the ever-popular balance issues that plague game books with character creation systems. You've got a strong incentive to put a lot of your points into combat skills, and this will tend to make most of the fights too easy. Fail to do this though, and a couple of the fights will feel too hard. Character generation seems as though it's a good idea when you're planning a book, but honestly it creates so many issues that I'm not sure it's ever actually worth it. You can balance for digital choices in character creation fairly easily, which is why item lists and skill lists are fine. But when your character could have 5 different skill levels associated with a stat, that just creates so many balance issues. Here you could have done away with the combat skill score, kept the body locations and the table, and just had players roll 2d6 to resolve the combat. That would have given the author more control over how difficult the combat actually is in practice. And you can still have a range of challenges to reflect different stakes, but it would be tied to the narrative, not to arbitrary decisions made outside the narrative and crucially outside of the control of the writer. The same thing is true of healing. It's so useful and so central that I think assigning a range of numbers to it is kind of pointless. Better to just have a random healing roll to constrain the variance but still give some sense that things are playing out differently. An average character gets 37 points to spend on skills in this book, and honestly 19 of them are probably spoken for at the start, which makes it a much less flexible system than it actually appears. However, overall I would say that The King's Demon definitely does more right than it does wrong. The best thing about it is how well it captures the feel of the show, something that is really hard to do well. Everything feels like it fits, albeit with the fantasy elements pushed to the fore. System problems are a lot more forgivable when the systems actually work and the overall presentation is solid, and that's definitely the case here. One small gripe is I would have liked more and bigger artwork from Russ Nicholson. The artwork is typically good, but it also feels quite cramped, and it feels like full-page illustrations rather than sort of half-page illustrations, which is what we get here. Would have done an even better job of complementing the action, but that may have been something that was mandated by production costs. Most of these are happily more niggles than serious issues. I say give it a go, it's a lot of fun. It's also fairly affordable to get your own copy, which is also good. I'm almost certainly going to do the second book in the series at some point. Well, that is all for this episode. I'll be back with a new episode in a couple of weeks when we'll be continuing the slow march to the end of the original run of Fighting Fantasy gamebooks with Jonathan Green's Spellbreaker. That's one I'm very curious about because Jonathan Green is an important figure in the modern gamebook scene. I do hope you will join me then. In the meantime, you can contact me by email at hjdoomretrofun, all one word, at gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky. I should mention that Fantastic Fights is now available on YouTube on the HJ Doom channel. I keep forgetting that that is a thing. Thank you very much for listening, take care, and I'll see you soon.